Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown Hunts the Shadow Man, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown confronts the shadow. They buried him at noon, but by nightfall someone had put his shoes back on the church steps, still dripping with blood. I had been standing in the dim vestry watching the rain stripe down the warped glass, when the first whisper came, low, broken, and urgent. It wasn't confession, it wasn't even prayer. It was the kind of whisper that sounded like it had crawled through the walls to find me. Outside, the village seemed asleep, yet the air had that tight electric stillness that comes before a storm, or before something worse. The name they spoke was one I knew well, too well. A man buried hours earlier whose body I had blessed beneath a grey and empty sky. But if the whisper was true, then death had not stopped him from walking, or from delivering some silent, impossible message to the living. I wanted to believe it was hysteria, but hysteria doesn't leave bloodstains. When I stepped out onto the wet cobblestones, the street lamps flickered like they were holding their breath. There, under the dripping shadow of the chapel's spire, lay the shoes. The same leather scuffed and worn with the same silver buckles. The smell hit first, not fresh blood but old, clotted and sour, the way it smells after it has sat too long under the skin. I touched one shoe, still warm. No one in the village had come forward, but I could feel the eyes on me from behind shuttered windows. People had seen something. People always see something. It's the speaking of it that terrifies them. And yet, the silence felt heavier than fear. It felt rehearsed. The widow refused to meet my eyes at first. Her fingers worked endlessly at the hem of her shawl, as though if she stopped, she'd say something she could never take back. When she finally spoke, her voice was brittle enough to snap in the wind. "He didn't die clean, Father. You know that, don't you?" But before I could answer, her hand clamped over her mouth as if she'd betrayed herself. I began to ask questions, not about the shoes, but about the day before the burial. People remember more when they don't think they're being interrogated. The baker spoke of a stranger lingering near the churchyard at dawn, staring at the graveyard gate. The innkeeper said no one checked into the rooms that week, yet he found a damp cloak in the hallway at midnight. None of them noticed details that mattered, like how a man could leave his shoes on the chapel steps hours after the coffin was lowered. That evening, the storm finally broke. I walked the church aisles alone, candle in hand, feeling the wet air creep in through the stone. And then I saw it, a smear, almost invisible, on the wood of the third pew from the front. A handprint. The fingers were long, too long, and the pressure mark suggested weight, as though someone had leaned there in the dark. I followed the prints down the aisle, past the altar, toward the sacristy door. They faded halfway, swallowed by the shadows until there was nothing but the cold sound of rain. My candle flickered, and then, without warning, I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep behind me. I turned, but the nave was empty. Only the echo of that single step lingered. My own pulse began to match the slow drip from the eaves. In the faint light, I caught something, just a flicker, sliding along the far wall as if the darkness itself had detached and was moving. By midnight, the village bell began to toll on its own. No wind, no rope pull, just a deep, slow peal that rattled the bones of the church. I stood under the bell tower and listened as it rang exactly 13 times. The number landed like a weight in my chest. 13. Never a number the church uses, never a number we count in holy rites. I thought then of the grave. I thought of the earth, still loose, still soft, and the coffin below it. I thought of what it would mean if it were empty. My hand tightened on the brass. Key in my pocket. Somewhere in the dark, I knew someone, or something, was waiting for me to open that gate, but I didn't go to the graveyard. Not yet. Instead, I went back to the chapel and waited. The smell of wet stone and old incense filled the air. My candle burned low, and then, at the edge of the light, the shape returned. It didn't move like a man. It didn't move like anything I knew. It slid along the floor, pulling the shadow of the pews with it, until it stopped just inside the circle of light. I could see the faint outline of a head, but no face, no features, only the sense that it was watching me. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The shadow tilted, almost like it was listening, almost like it understood. Then it moved forward, not walking, but closing the distance without a sound. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. That was when I saw it, dangling from its form, swaying gently. A silver buckle. The same buckle from the shoes. Outside, only now, it was slick with something darker than water. And then the candle went out. In the dark, the voice returned. Only this time, it spoke my name. "I will tell you this much. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that whatever walked in that church with me that night was not the man we buried. But I also know this. Some truths are better left in the shadows, because the shadow is still here. And it's waiting." Chapter 2. The Clue. No one else saw. They all swore the body had nothing in its hands, yet I saw his fingers clutching something so tightly it had cut into his skin. It had been less than a day since the shoes appeared on the chapel steps, and the village had sunk deeper into its own silence. No one wanted to speak of the burial, the bell toll, or the shadow that had moved where no shadow should. Yet my mind was fixed on something small. Something everyone else had missed. A detail so slight that, to anyone else, it would have seemed like nothing at all. I returned to the grave at dawn when the mist still clung low to the ground. The earth had settled unevenly, not in the way it does from rain or time, but as if something beneath had shifted, pressing upward. My eyes went to the coffin lid in my mind's memory, the way the hands of the dead had been folded, almost unnaturally. Everyone else had looked at the face, the suit, the polished wood. But I had seen the hand, curved, tense, resisting the stillness of death. Now, standing over the grave, I could almost hear it, the faint sound of knuckles grinding against bone. It was nonsense, of course. A priest hears many things in a graveyard that are nothing more than the wind. But I had learned long ago that the smallest, strangest details often spoke the loudest truth. I didn't dig. Not yet. Instead, I went to the undertaker. He was polishing a lantern when I asked if he'd noticed anything unusual about the body. His answer came too quickly. "No, Father. Nothing at all." His eyes flicked once to the drawer at the far end of the room before settling back on me. A drawer meant for forgotten things. Buttons, cufflinks, bits of ribbon. I knew then that whatever I was looking for was inside it. When he left to fetch tea, I opened it. At first, it seemed ordinary. Scraps of cloth, a rosary bead, an old brass button. But then I found it, tucked beneath a torn scrap of lining. A thin strip of parchment, curled at the edges, stained dark at one end. The stain was not ink. It was blood. The writing was almost illegible, blurred from dampness, but one word stood out. A name. Not the name of the man we had buried, but another. Someone I had not heard in years. The kind of name people in the village didn't speak anymore, except in stories told in low voices over ale. And yet, here it was, hidden in the coffin of a man who supposedly died without enemies. I left without telling the undertaker what I'd taken. Some truths need to sit in silence before they are spoken. As I walked back to the church, I felt the parchment pressing through the lining of my coat like it wanted to be found by someone else, and then I saw it. On the edge of the churchyard, half hidden by the stone wall, a figure watching me. It was tall, still, and dressed in a dark coat that seemed to swallow the morning light. I couldn't see the face, only the way the head tilted slightly when I stopped walking. It didn't move closer, didn't run. It only watched, and then, in a blink, it was gone, swallowed by the mist. By afternoon, the air in the village had changed. People walked faster, spoke less. I knew without being told that word had spread. Not about the parchment, but about the fact that I had been seen with something. That kind of gossip travels faster than any truth. I kept the name to myself, even as I went through the parish records, pulling dusty ledgers and brittle baptism lists. I found it eventually, in the margin of a sole marriage registry, crossed out so heavily the ink had eaten through the paper. Whoever had done it wanted the name erased completely. That was when I heard the sound again. A slow, deliberate creak from the back of the church. I turned, but no one stood there, just the faint impression of a handprint on the pew, as though someone had been leaning, watching. The same pew as the night before, the same impossible hand. I went to it, running my fingers over the grain, and that's when I noticed it. A tiny indentation in the wood no bigger than the tip of a nail, but too clean, too deliberate to be an accident. Inside it was a thread. Black. Frayed. The sort of thing you'd find on the cuff of a coat worn by someone who spends more time in the dark than in the daylight. I pocketed the thread, though I knew it wouldn't be enough to convince anyone. This was the kind of clue that lived in the quiet space between facts and fears, the kind of thing you only understand when you've seen it in a nightmare first. The kind of clue no one else saw because they weren't looking for the truth, only for the comfort of not knowing. That night, I sat with the parchment under the flicker of a single candle. The name stared back at me like an accusation. The flame trembled, though there was no draught. And then I heard it. A sound from outside, sharp and metallic, like a key turning in a lock. I rose, but before I reached the door, I saw it. The shadow of someone standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. I did not open it, because I already knew. If I opened that door, I would see a face I had last seen in the confessional. A face that should have been buried years ago. The parchment slipped from my hand and landed in the candle's glow curling at the edges. I let it burn until the name was nothing but ash. Some things, I thought, are better lost. And yet, even as I extinguished the flame, I knew the truth hadn't gone anywhere, because the shadow was still there, waiting. Chapter 3. Father Brown Faces a Silent Killer. They say death makes a sound, but this one didn't, even as he stood 2 feet from me. It was early evening when the first body was found. No wound, no struggle, no cry for help. Just a man sitting at his kitchen table, eyes open, a half-filled glass of water in front of him, and an expression that seemed frozen somewhere between shock and surrender. The doctor called it heart failure. The widow called it God's will. But I knew neither was true, because I had seen the same expression once before, years ago, on another face, in another parish, under circumstances no coroner dared to write down. The village was uneasy, but not frightened. Fear comes when death feels close. This was still the kind of tragedy people could distance themselves from. Yet by the second day, when another man was found in the same condition, same posture, same untouched drink on the table, the whispers began. 2 sudden deaths without a mark on the body. The odds were too slim, even for a village that prayed often. I visited both houses. In the first, the air still carried the faint scent of something bitter, metallic, almost like rain hitting hot iron. In the second, the scent was gone, but the silence was heavier. There was no sign of intrusion, no sign of violence, and yet something lingered, a residue not of touch, but of presence. It was the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but I had felt it before. The weight of a room that has been emptied too quickly, as though someone or something had slipped out just before I entered. By the third day, a third body appeared. This one was different. It was not a man, but a woman, found on the floor of her garden shed, kneeling as if in prayer. No glass, no table, no staged scene. But her face bore the same expression, that haunting half shock, half acceptance. The villagers began speaking of a curse. Some swore it was the ghost of the man buried last week. Others whispered about an illness that killed without fever, without warning. I knew better. Death rarely works without warning. It just hides the signs from those unwilling to see. I went to the church archives, looking for patterns. Within an hour, I had found 3 deaths from the past decade that fit the same description. No wounds, no cause, and no logical explanation. They had been buried quietly, the families comforted with kind lies, and in each case, the deceased had attended a gathering the night before they died. I began to ask questions about those gatherings. Who had been there? What had been served? Who had spoken last? Most remembered nothing unusual, but one woman, her voice trembling, recalled a man who never spoke, never drank, never ate, just sat in the corner watching. When she described his coat, my chest tightened. Black wool frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of damp, the same kind of coat whose thread I had found in the church pew. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the rectory felt deliberate. The creak of the floorboards, the faint tap at the window, the long pause before silence returned. And then, somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang once. Not a peal, just one heavy strike, as if to mark a single moment in time. The next morning, I walked through the village square and saw him. Tall, gaunt, his face pale beneath the shadow of a brimmed hat, he stood too still for the living, and yet too solid for a ghost. His eyes, when they met mine, were not dead, but patient. The kind of patience that waits for you to make the wrong move. I followed him as far as the old mill. He never looked back, never altered his pace. But when I reached the doorway, he was gone, vanished into a space too small to hide a man. The only thing left behind was a chair, its seat still warm, and on it a glass of water. I didn't touch it. By evening, a 4th death struck. The same stillness, the same absence of cause. The villagers locked their doors. Lamps burned in every window, as though light could hold back something that didn't need to enter through doors. I stood in the church, the thread from the coat and the memory of the name on the parchment burning in my thoughts. That was when I realized none of the victims had cried out. Not one had tried to escape. It was as if they had seen something so certain, so final, that they accepted it without struggle. A killer who doesn't just take life, but convinces you to give it up. A killer who needs no weapon but presence. That night, as I sat in the dark, I felt it. The air shifted, cold and weightless. My candle went out, and from the far corner of the room, I saw him, closer now, the brim of his hat casting his eyes into shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between us was a blade. I knew then why the others had surrendered, but I am not like the others. And if he has come for me, he will have to face something he has never faced before, because I see him. And I am still here. Chapter 4. The Secret Hidden in Plain Sight. They all stared at the photograph for hours, but none of them saw the man who wasn't supposed to be there, until I told them where to look. The photograph was meant to be harmless. A gathering in the village square captured in the pale winter light, the kind of image people frame and place on mantelpieces. It had been taken a week before the first of the silent deaths, and now it was being passed from hand to hand like a relic, as though it might explain the horror pressing in on the village. Everyone saw the same thing: smiling faces, familiar coats, the cobblestones slick from frost. Everyone except me. I saw him. It wasn't the coat or the hat that gave him away. Those were common enough here. It was the angle of his body, standing just out of step, head turned towards something no one else could see. The shadow cast by his hat brim ran the wrong way, cutting against the light, and his eyes, though barely visible, had the same patient, predatory stillness I had seen before. The villagers hadn't noticed him because they weren't looking for someone who didn't belong. The widow of the second victim insisted there had been no stranger that day. She had walked the square twice, she said, and seen every face. But when I pointed to the figure in the photograph, her mouth tightened, and she asked to leave. Fear can take many shapes, but that was the shape of recognition, buried deep, denied even to oneself. I took the photograph back to the rectory and studied it under the lamplight. Around the shadowed figure, people laughed, bartered at the stalls, carried baskets of bread. Yet every person within 3 feet of him seemed blurred, their expressions dulled, as if his presence bled into the air around him. It was the kind of detail the human mind overlooks because it doesn't make sense. But I had learned to look for what doesn't make sense. The problem was, this wasn't proof. No court, no constable, no parish council would believe me based on a shadow in a photograph, but I didn't need them to believe. I only needed them to stop pretending they couldn't see it. By morning, the photograph had gone missing. The parish secretary swore she had left it in the vestry, but when I asked who had been in the church overnight, she hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Someone had come to remove what was never meant to be seen. Later that day, I visited the home of the third victim. Her son was still there, packing, her belongings into boxes. He let me look through them. In the bottom drawer of her writing desk, I found another photograph, smaller, faded but unmistakable. The same man. This time he was standing at the edge of a baptism gathering, half hidden by a doorway, his eyes fixed not on the child, but on the priest holding it. The dates on the photographs were years apart. The people in them were different, but the man had not aged a day. I left the house with the photograph in my pocket, my mind, turning over what it meant. There are explanations you can speak aloud, and there are those that take root in the mind like thorns, cutting you every time you try to pull them out. This was the latter. By dusk, I had both photographs laid out on my desk. I stared at them until the lamplight seemed to flicker without wind. Then I realized the background wasn't the same, but one detail was identical. A wrought-iron lamppost, crooked slightly to the left. It had been in the square for decades, and yet in both photographs the man stood directly beneath it. The same place, the same stance, the same distance from the people around him. It wasn't random. It was ritual. I went to the square that night. The lamppost leaned the same way it had in the photographs, its paint chipped, its base crusted with years of frost. I stood where the man had stood and waited. The square was empty, silent. Then, somewhere behind me, a soft scuff of leather on stone. I turned, but no one was there. Only the sound of the wind curling through the alleys. When I looked back at the lamppost, I noticed something etched into the metal, so faint it could only be seen in the right light. A series of marks, not letters, not numbers, but symbols. The kind of symbols that seem harmless until you realize they are always found in places where something has gone wrong. I traced one with my finger. The iron felt cold, too cold for the mild night. And then I heard it. My name, whispered from somewhere close enough to touch. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the shadows, but saw only the square, empty as before. I don't know how long I stood there. The square seemed to shift around me, the light bending in strange ways, until the lamppost no longer leaned, but stood perfectly straight. The air was too still, too tight, as though the world was holding its breath. When I returned to the rectory, the photographs were gone from my desk. In their place was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a line, written in a hand I did not recognize. "You see it now? Don't look again." I burned the paper in the hearth, but the words remained in my mind. Some things are hidden, not because they're small, but because they're always there, woven into the fabric of the everyday, waiting for someone to notice. And when you do, you can never unsee them. I know where to look now, and I know he knows I'm looking. Chapter 5. Father Brown unmasks the dark stranger. They thought his face would bring answers, but when the mask came off, every single person in the room wished it had stayed on. It happened in the parish hall, under the pale flicker of the single light that swayed like it was trying to escape the ceiling. The man had been brought in quietly, without chains, without protest, his tall frame wrapped in the same black coat I'd seen shadowing the village for weeks. No one had ever heard him speak, and no one had seen him close enough to swear to his features. The constable called him a vagrant. I knew better. You don't stalk without purpose. You don't linger without a plan. From the moment he stepped inside, the air changed. People who had come out of curiosity began to shift uneasily, avoiding his gaze as though some invisible pressure forced their eyes down. His presence wasn't loud. It was heavier than that, like a cold weight pressed into the corners of the room. I could hear the faint scrape of leather as he flexed his gloves, the sound almost lost beneath the wind, rattling the old glass windows. The constable cleared his throat and said we would remove the mask for identification purposes. But I knew from the tightening in the stranger's shoulders that the mask wasn't for us. It was for him. He was keeping something in, not keeping something out. The constable reached forward, fingers brushing the edge of the black cloth. The man didn't flinch. He only turned his head, slightly, as though listening to something far away. When the mask came free, the first reaction wasn't shock. It was confusion. The face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light. The features unremarkable in their arrangement, and yet wrong in a way no one could name. His eyes were a colour I couldn't place, shifting with each glance, sometimes grey, sometimes green, sometimes darker than both. But it wasn't his face that froze the room. It was the sudden realization that every person there recognized him, and yet could not say from where. Recognition without memory is a dangerous thing. It unsettles the mind, makes you doubt your own past. I saw it ripple through the crowd, men who had fought in wars, women who had buried husbands, each of them looking as if a thread had been pulled from somewhere deep inside, unravelling a part of themselves they'd thought was safe. I asked him his name. He smiled, not warmly, not coldly, but as if the question was somehow beneath him. Then, without moving his lips, I heard it. My name. Clear as a bell in my own head, though the others didn't react. He hadn't spoken aloud. I knew then what kind of danger we were in. The constable began to question him, asking where he'd been, what he wanted in the village. The man didn't answer, but his eyes moved from face to face, slow and deliberate, as if taking something from each person without touching them. The constable grew angry, slamming his fist against the table, but the man only turned his gaze on him, and the constable stepped back, his jaw slack, his skin gone pale. I realized I had seen that same look before, on the victims, the half-shock, half-acceptance, the silent surrender. I asked to speak with him alone. The others left reluctantly, though. I could see the relief in their faces when they stepped out into the hall. The door closed, and we were alone. The room felt smaller, the shadows thicker. "You've been here before," I said. His smile deepened. "Many times." "What do you want?" "I take nothing that isn't given," he said, though his voice didn't sound like it came from across the table. It was inside my skull, like a thought I couldn't push away. and what was given by the dead. They gave me themselves. I felt the cold then, not around me but inside, a slow frost spreading through my thoughts. I gripped the arms of my chair and forced myself to speak. Why here? Why now? He leaned forward slightly, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold, a reflection of me, but not as I was. Older, worn, with a face that carried the same stillness as his. I stood, breaking whatever hold he had on me, but he didn't follow. He only said, "It will be your turn soon, Father." When I left the room, the constable asked me who he was. I told him the truth. No one you can hold, no one you can name. That night, I locked the church doors and sat in the dark. The image of his face burned into my mind. Not because of what it was, but because of the thing I recognized in it, the part of myself that looked back. And I knew then that unmasking him hadn't revealed anything. It had only shown me how much I didn't want to see. Chapter 6. The Last Witness, Who Vanished. They swore she left the rectory alive, but I was the one who locked the door behind her, and I have not seen her since. Her name was Margaret Vale, and she was the only living person who had claimed to see the dark stranger's face before the parish hall. She arrived at my door just after sunset, her cloak dripping from the rain, her hands trembling not from cold, but from something far more corrosive. I could tell she had rehearsed her visit, but whatever, words she had prepared seemed to dissolve as soon as she stepped inside. She sat by the fire, eyes darting toward the windows, as if something outside had followed her there. "I can't stay long," she whispered. "He'll know." The he was obvious. I didn't press her. Instead, I waited. People reveal more when silence has weight. She finally said she'd seen him, close enough to smell the damp of his coat, close enough to feel the air change when he looked at her. And she had noticed something no one else had. He was carrying something in his hand. "What was it?" I asked. Her answer was slow, careful, a key. But it wasn't his. Before I could question further, she glanced toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. I shouldn't be here. I assured her she was safe, but she shook her head. "You don't understand. He doesn't need to be in the room to be here." I walked her to the front door, rain still whispering against the stones. She stepped out into the street, pulling her cloak tighter. I locked the door behind her and watched from the window as she walked away, her figure shrinking into the fog. That was the last time I saw her. By morning her cottage was empty. Not just empty, stripped bare. No furniture, no clothing, not even dust where her belongings should have been. The neighbours swore she hadn't returned home the night before. One claimed to have seen her turn into the alley behind the old mill. Another said she had been speaking to a man in a dark coat by the church gates. None of them were certain, and none of them wanted to keep talking. I searched the alley behind the mill. The air there felt wrong, still but with the faint echo of movement, as though someone had just stepped out of sight. In the corner, half buried in mud, I found a single object, a key, old brass worn smooth from years of use. The teeth were oddly filed, not in the shape of any local lock. When I held it in my hand, a chill crept up my arm. Back at the rectory, I studied the key under lamplight. There was something engraved along the shaft, faint, shallow, almost erased. Letters, but not in a language I recognized. The symbols were jagged, precise, each one catching the light as though the metal resisted being seen too clearly. That night I dreamed of Margaret. She was standing at the far end of the church aisle, holding the same key, her lips moving as if speaking to me. But no sound came. The shadows along the pews deepened until they weren't shadows at all, but figures. Tall, thin, motionless. One of them stepped forward, and the dream ended. The next day, I took the key to the oldest locksmith in the county. He turned it over in his hands, frowning. "This doesn't open anything," he said. "Not in the way you're thinking." I asked him what he meant, but he only pushed it back across the counter. "If you're smart, Father, You'll lose this before it finds you. That night, I placed the key in a locked box and hid it in the vestry. By morning, the box was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, only a single piece of paper lying where the box had been. On it, in a hand I now recognized, were 4 words. She gave it to me. The words could only mean one thing. Margaret had seen him again, and whatever happened after that, she had given him the key willingly. But if she had, why had the key returned to me before disappearing once more? The villagers have stopped speaking her name. It is as if she never existed. And yet, sometimes, at night, I think I hear her voice outside the rectory, calling for me in the rain. I never open the door, because I know if I do, she won't be standing there. And if she is, it won't be Margaret anymore. Chapter 7. Father Brown breaks the killer's alibi. They said he couldn't have done it because he was already dead, but I've never seen a corpse that could write a letter after burial. The case had reached that stage where everyone felt certain they knew the truth, and yet no one dared say it out loud. The man accused, Harold Price, had an alibi so watertight the constable nearly laughed when I suggested it might be false. On the night of the murder, Price had been found lying lifeless in his bed, the doctor declaring him gone from a sudden heart attack. His funeral had been swift, his grave already sealed. That should have been the end of it. And yet, 2 days after the burial, a letter appeared on the desk of the parish clerk. It was short, written in a slanted, hurried hand, and signed by Harold Price himself. It contained only 8 words. She saw what she should not have seen. The she was never named, but the ink was still fresh when it was found. The constable insisted it was a prank, that someone had forged the handwriting. But I had read Price's letters before. The peculiar way he crossed his T's, the sharp hook on the Y's, those were habits no forger would think to replicate. If it was forged, it was done by someone who knew him intimately. If it wasn't forged, then we were left with a far stranger truth. I went to the widow, a woman whose grief seemed rehearsed in its precision. She insisted her husband had been home all evening, too weak to stand, let alone commit, murder. But when I asked where she was at the moment he died, she faltered. I was resting, she said, but her eyes slid to the mantelpiece where a black envelope sat half hidden behind a vase. Later, when she left the room, I examined it. Inside was another letter, also signed by Price, but dated the day after his burial. This one was longer, its sentences fractured, as if written in a rush. It spoke of finishing the work and making sure she stays silent. Again, no names. I left without confronting her, certain that if she had this letter, she knew more than she was willing to admit. The next step was to visit the grave. That night, under a heavy moon, I walked to the churchyard. The soil on Price's grave was uneven, disturbed. Not by weather, but by hands. Someone had been here recently and they had not been careful. Near the headstone, half buried in loose earth, I found a scrap of paper. Mud-stained but legible, it bore 3 words in Price's hand. It wasn't me. If Price hadn't committed the murder, then who had? And why was his name tied to it, even in death? The clue was not in what the letters said, but in where they appeared. Each one had been left in a place where it would be found by a specific person. People who already feared the truth. The constable still clung to the alibi. You can't hang a man who's in the ground, he told me. But I began to wonder if Price had ever been in that coffin at all. The doctor who declared him dead was a friend of his. The undertaker's apprentice had left town the day after the funeral, and no one could recall seeing Price's face after the supposed heart attack, except for his wife. I visited the undertaker's workshop. In the corner, hidden behind a stack of unused boards, I found a coat, Price's coat, still damp, smelling faintly of the river. In the pocket was a train ticket dated the morning after his funeral, with no destination printed, only the station's stamp. It was enough to make the impossible plausible. Price hadn't died, not then. He had staged it, buried an empty coffin, and used the alibi to mask something far worse. But the murder? That still didn't fit. Unless the person he'd wanted dead was the same person who could have exposed the ruse. The first big reveal came not from the living, but from the dead. The church ledger, a decade old, contained a baptism record signed by Price as godfather. The child's mother, the very woman now claiming to be the murder victim's grieving sister. That tie changed everything. The victim had known the truth about Price's survival because she'd been part of the plan to help him vanish once before. As the pieces fell into place, I began to see the true shape of the crime. The alibi wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. By dying, Price had ensured no one would suspect him of killing the only person who could destroy him. But in crafting the perfect alibi, he had also given himself away. Because the dead don't write letters. I tracked him to an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the moor. He didn't run when he saw me. He only smiled, the kind of smile a man gives when he thinks he's already won. "You can't prove it," he said. "You're right," I told him. "I can't prove it in court, but I can prove it to the one person you're still afraid of." His smile faltered then. That was all I needed. The constable never found Price. By the time they reached the farmhouse, it was empty, the floorboards bare except for a single sheet of paper nailed to the wall. On it, in his unmistakable hand, were the words, "I told you it wasn't me." I keep that paper in my desk drawer, not as evidence, but as a reminder. Some alibis aren't meant to convince the law. They're meant to convince the guilty they're still safe. Chapter 8. The Truth Buried Beneath the Chapel. They said the chapel stood on holy ground, but when I broke through the stone floor, the first thing I touched was a human skull. It was during a storm that the ceiling above the altar began to leak. The rain came in a steady whisper, pooling on the tiles before running in crooked lines toward the sanctuary steps. While the villagers worried about the roof, my eyes kept drifting to the cracks in the floor, thin, jagged lines spidering out from the altar's base. They had not been there before. Stone does not move without reason, and something about the way those cracks spread reminded me of a map, as if the chapel itself was showing me where to look. The chapel was old, older than the village around it. The records claimed it had been built over the ruins of an even older church, but no one could say what had stood there before that. When I asked the parish archivist, she said only, "Some things are better left in the ground." But I have never been one to leave well enough alone when the ground itself is whispering. The first time I pressed my ear to the tiles, I heard it. A faint echo, not of water or shifting stone, but of air moving somewhere beneath. That meant there was space under the chapel, space where there should have been solid earth. At night, when the storm had eased, I returned alone. I moved the altar cloth aside and took a small chisel to the crack nearest the base. The stone resisted at first, but then, with a reluctant groan, a piece came free. Cold air spilled upward, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and something older, something metallic and sour. I widened the gap, each strike echoing too loudly in the dark. When I finally made an opening large enough to see through, I held my lamp over it and looked down. The beam caught on the curve of bone, yellowed, weathered, and unmistakably human. The skull lay on its side, jaw half open as if still mid-scream. And it was not alone. The light slid. Across more bones, stacked and tangled, the remnants of more than one body. I should have stopped then, but I climbed down. The chamber beneath was no crypt. It was too low, too narrow, more like a crawl space carved into the earth. The bones lay haphazard, some broken, some still clothed in scraps of rotted fabric. I counted at least 6 skulls before I stopped trying. At the far end of the space, something caught my eye. A shape not made by nature. It was a wooden chest, blackened by age, its surface etched with marks like the ones I had seen on the lamppost in the village square. The lock had long since rusted away. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, were 3 objects: a tarnished chalice, a dagger with a carved bone handle, and a book so decayed that the pages crumbled at my touch. But on the first page, still legible in faded ink, was a single line: "To keep the witness from speaking, bury the truth with them." I left the chamber with the chest, sealing the hole in the floor, before dawn. But even in the safety of the rectory, I could not shake the feeling that I had brought something up with me, something that had waited a long time to be disturbed. The next day, I began asking questions about the chapel's history again. An old mason remembered working on repairs 50 years ago and being told never to dig near the altar. A woman who cleaned the chapel as a girl recalled hearing knocking sounds from beneath the floor during evening prayers, sounds her mother told her. Were the stones settling? The first big reveal came when I examined the dagger closely. On its handle was an engraving, 2 initials, interlocked. They matched the signature on a ledger entry from nearly a century ago, the name of a priest who had vanished from the parish without explanation. The ledger's final note under his name was a single word: transferred. But there was no record of where. It became clear that the bones beneath the chapel were not the victims of an accident, nor the casualties of war. They had been put there deliberately, along with the chest, as if sealing away not just bodies but evidence. The phrase in the book, "bury the truth with them," was no metaphor. That night, as I sat alone in the rectory, I heard a sound from the chapel, 3 slow knocks coming from beneath the floor. I went to the door but did not open it. The knocking stopped. In its place came a whisper, too faint to make out the words but close enough to feel the breath of it. I no longer doubt what lies beneath the chapel. The truth is there, bound up in bones and relics, in the silence of a place meant for prayer. But I also know that some truths do not forgive being uncovered. And somewhere in this village, someone else knows what I found, because the chest is gone. Chapter 9. Father Brown hunts the vanishing man. They swore he was locked inside the room, but when I opened the door, there was nothing left except the sound of someone breathing. The case began with an impossible disappearance. Thomas Redding, a man with no family and too many secrets, had been under suspicion for months. Witnesses placed him near every unsettling event in the village: the silent deaths, the missing woman, the disturbed grave beneath the chapel. When the constable finally decided to arrest him, he was found sitting alone in a locked upstairs room of the Black Swan Inn. The key was in the constable's pocket. The windows were bolted shut. There was nowhere for him to go. And yet, by the time the door was opened again, he was gone. The constable wanted to blame the latch, to say perhaps they'd left it unfastened. But I had stood there myself, hand on the cold brass, watching as the key turned and the lock clicked into place. I had heard the scrape of the bolt, sliding home. Redding had been there. He had even smiled at me before the door closed. And now he was nowhere. The villagers whispered of tricks and devils. Some claimed he was never a man at all, only the shadow of one, capable of slipping through walls. Others insisted someone had helped him, someone trusted, but no one could explain why the room was empty, or why the air inside still carried the faint scent of his tobacco, as though he had only just risen from the chair. I searched the room, myself. The bed was unmade, the table bare except for a half-empty glass. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but when I knelt to examine them, I found no hidden trapdoor, no loose plank. The walls were solid stone, their cold surface damp to the touch. I tried the window, it would not budge, and yet I could not shake the feeling that he was still in the room somehow, just not where I could see him. The innkeeper said he had checked the room the night before and found nothing unusual, but When I asked about the guests staying in the rooms above and below, he hesitated. The room below Redding's had been empty for weeks. At least, that was the story. When I went to see for myself, I found the door locked, the air stale with neglect. Inside, dust lay thick over everything except for one section of the floor where faint footprints marked a path toward the far wall. I pressed my hand against that wall. It sounded hollow. A seam ran down the center, almost invisible in the dim light, the plaster over it crumbling slightly at the edges. Someone had been through here, but when I pushed, it didn't give. Later that night, while the inn was quiet, I returned to the empty room below. I tapped the wall again, listening for the echo. On the fourth tap, I heard something else, faint, deliberate, 3 knocks from the other side. I froze, my hand still against the plaster. The knocks came again, slower this time, and then a voice, low and close, spoke a single word. Leave. The next morning I spoke to the only person who had seen Redding that day before his vanishing, a maid who swore she'd brought him tea and found him talking to someone, though she couldn't see who. She said his voice had been strange, layered, as if another voice spoke beneath it. I asked if she could remember any of the words. She hesitated before saying. He asked if they could walk, without being seen. The first big reveal came when I traced the seam in the wall to the other side, into the cellar beneath the inn. There, behind a stack of rotting barrels, I found a narrow doorway bricked over, the mortar still fresh. Whoever had sealed it had done so recently, perhaps even after Redding's disappearance. When I asked the innkeeper about it, he claimed ignorance, but the look in his eyes told me he had not only known about the passage, he had used it before. What chilled me most wasn't the hidden door. It was the realization that the passage didn't lead out of the building, it led deeper in. And if Redding had gone that way, he hadn't escaped the inn at all. He had gone somewhere meant to keep him inside. That night I returned to the cellar. The bricked-up doorway was still there, but the barrels had been moved. And on the wall above the sealed entrance, someone had scrawled a message in soot. You cannot catch what you cannot see. I do not know if Redding left the inn by human means, or if he remains somewhere within its walls, waiting. But sometimes, when I pass the Black Swan at night, I feel the faintest movement in the shadows near the upper window. And once, just once, I saw a hand draw the curtain aside. Chapter 10. The murder that stopped the village. They said the church bell rang for no reason, but I was the one who found the rope tied around a dead man's hand. It began just after dawn, when the village awoke to the sound of the chapel bell tolling. 13 slow chimes, each one heavier than the last, carrying through the fog-choked streets like a warning. There had been no service planned, no reason for the bell to be rung. And yet, there it was, pulling the village out of its sleep and into something much darker. When I reached the chapel, the door was unlocked. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The scent of rain on stone mixed with something metallic, sharp enough to cut through the stillness. I followed it toward the belfry stairs. The rope hung slack at the bottom, swaying slightly as though someone had let go only moments before. That was when I saw the hand, pale, rigid, the rope coiled tightly around the fingers. It belonged to a man slumped against the wall, eyes open but unseeing, his lips frozen in what might have been the start of a scream. I knew him. Everyone did. Edward Hawthorne, the mill owner, a man who had built his fortune on the backs of others and kept it by knowing every secret worth knowing. His death should have been a relief to some, but instead it froze the village in place. No one moved, no one spoke. It wasn't grief. It was fear. The constable arrived and took one look before declaring it a suicide. He tied the rope, himself, rang the bell, and collapsed, he said. But something in that explanation rang false. The knot around his fingers was too tight, too deliberate, and there was the matter of the bruise on his temple, as if he'd been struck before he ever touched the rope. I began asking questions, but the answers came too quickly, too cleanly. Everyone claimed to have been asleep when the bell rang. No one had seen Hawthorne enter the chapel. Yet more than one person mentioned hearing footsteps in the square the night before, footsteps that stopped suddenly, as if the walker had vanished. The first thing I checked was Hawthorne's office at the mill. It was locked, but the window latch was broken, as though someone had forced it recently. Inside, the papers on his desk were neat, except for a single page lying in the centre. It was a ledger entry, dated the day before his death, listing a payment to W.R. No surname, no explanation. Beside the initials was a figure so large it could only mean one of two things: a debt or a bribe. The more I dug, the more the story began to twist. Hawthorne had been seen arguing with someone in the churchyard 2 nights earlier. The witness couldn't see the other person's face, but they described a tall figure in a dark coat, the same description given for the stranger who had been haunting the village for weeks. When I returned to the chapel, I examined the belfry more closely. The floorboards near the rope were scuffed, as though there had been a struggle, and beneath one of the boards I found a scrap of cloth, black wool frayed at the edges, the same as the thread I had once found in the church pew after another death. The first big reveal came when I traced the initials W.R. to an abandoned property at the edge of the moor. It had once belonged to a man named William Redding, the Vanishing Man, the very same man who had slipped from a locked room at the Black Swan Inn. The connection between him and Hawthorne was now undeniable, though its meaning remained hidden. By the time I returned to the village, the fear in the air had thickened. Shops remained shuttered. No one lingered in the streets. At the inn, voices dropped when I entered. Everyone knew something, but no one would speak it aloud. That night, I sat alone in the chapel, the rope from the bell still swaying faintly in the darkness above. I heard the faint creak of the belfry stairs, too slow to be the wind. I called out, but no answer came. The sound stopped, halfway, as if whoever had been there decided not to come down. The village has not been the same since. The mill remains closed, the bell silent. And yet, sometimes in the still hours before dawn, I hear it again. 13 slow chimes, each one carrying the weight of something left unfinished. I know who killed Edward Hawthorne, but if I speak it, the bell will ring for me next. Chapter 11. Father Brown finds a deadly letter. They said the letter had been delivered to a dead man, but when I read it, I realized it had been written by someone who wasn't supposed to be alive. It arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday, slipped beneath the rectory door without a sound. The envelope was thick, the paper rough to the touch, sealed with a smear of dark red wax. No name was written on the front, only a single symbol scratched into the paper. The same jagged mark I had seen once before, carved into the base of the chapel altar. That alone would have been enough to make me hesitate, but the weight of it told me there was more inside than just words. When I broke the seal, a folded sheet fell out, along with something small and metallic. The sheet was handwritten in a hurried, slanted script, Price's handwriting without question. But Price was dead. Not buried, not missing. Dead. I had watched the earth fall on his coffin myself, and yet here his words were before me. Fresh ink, bleeding into the fibres of the paper. It wasn't a letter in the usual sense. It was a confession of sorts, though no crime was directly named. Price wrote of a night without footsteps, of a face that cannot belong to the living, and of a task he had been given but could not finish. He warned me not to trust the one who smiles without showing their teeth. The metallic object wrapped in the paper was a key, old and rusted, its teeth filed in an irregular pattern. The more I read, the more the sense of unease thickened. There was a final line at the bottom, written in smaller letters as if meant to be overlooked. You will know the door by the sound it makes when you knock twice. The meaning was unclear, but the certainty in the words was not. I went to the constable with the letter, but he dismissed it outright. "Someone's playing games with you, Father," he said. "Price is dead, and this is nothing more than a cruel imitation." But I could see it in his eyes. He recognized something in the handwriting, and it unsettled him. That night, I searched the village for any lock that might match the key. None did. The pattern of the teeth was too unusual, as though meant for something not quite meant to be opened by ordinary means. When I returned to the rectory, the letter was gone from my desk. Only the key remained, resting in the centre of the blotter as though it had been deliberately placed there after the paper was taken. The first big reveal came from an unlikely source: the widow of Edward Hawthorne. She arrived at the church unannounced, pale and trembling, holding a torn scrap of paper. It matched the missing letter exactly, down to the fibres. She claimed she had found it in her late husband's coat pocket, though she swore she had never seen the full document before. "He burned the rest," she said no one should read it. The fragment contained only a few words, but enough to set the ground shifting beneath me. "The key is not for a door." That sentence, simple as it was, overturned every assumption I'd made. If the key wasn't for a door, then what was it meant to unlock? A box? A chest? Something hidden far closer to us than we realized. As the days passed, I began to notice small changes in the village. Doors I was certain had been locked now hung open. Lamps in empty houses flickered at night. And twice I found muddy footprints outside the chapel, leading to the vestry door, but never away from it. One evening I tested the key in the chapel itself. None of the locks yielded, until I tried the narrow wooden cabinet at the back of the vestry, a piece of furniture no one paid much mind to. The key turned with a reluctant click. Inside was not a shelf of candlesticks or chalices, but a false back panel. Behind it lay a single envelope, yellowed and brittle, addressed to me in the same jagged hand that had marked the first envelope. I opened it with shaking fingers. The letter inside was short. "You are closer than you think, but when you find the truth, it will already have found you." I looked up then, sensing movement in the dim vestry. The air seemed heavier, the shadows longer than they should have been. Somewhere behind me, floorboards creaked, but when I turned, there was no one there. Only the faint scent of tobacco, the same scent that had lingered in Redding's locked room before he vanished. I have not yet decided what to do with the key. It sits now in my desk drawer, cold against my hand whenever I touch it. I do not doubt that it still has one more lock to open, and that whatever it reveals will not be kind. I know who sent the letter, but if I speak the name, the next one delivered will be for me. Chapter 12. The Shadow's Final Move Against Father. They said it would end with silence, but when I opened my eyes, the shadow was standing over my bed, holding my own rosary in its hand. It began on the coldest night of the year, when the moon was nothing more than a thin, colourless scar in the sky. The village had already retreated indoors, shutters drawn tight, candles burning low. I had been working late in the rectory, sifting through weeks of tangled notes and half-buried truths, when I felt it. A shift in the air like a breath drawn just behind me. It was the same sensation I'd felt in the chapel, in the alley, in the cellar of the Black Swan Inn. A presence, not quite human, not entirely other. When I turned, there was nothing. But the papers on my desk had been disturbed, the top sheet turned over to reveal 3 words written in a jagged, unsteady hand. "It is time." No signature, no explanation. Only the certainty that the shadow had made its move. The problem was that I could not predict what form it would take. Every previous encounter had been different, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a footprint where none should be, sometimes the faint impression of a figure standing just at the edge of sight. But this was different. This was a direct message, and that meant it was ready to act. I checked the locks on the doors and windows twice before extinguishing the lamps, but long after I lay down I could not sleep. The room felt too still, the silence too deep. Some point. Exhaustion must have taken me because the next thing I remember is waking to find my rosary, normally hanging on the wall, dangling from the fingers of a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. The weight of its gaze held me in place, though its face was obscured by the same impenetrable shadow that always cloaked it. The rosary beads shifted once in its hand, clicking together softly, like the sound of distant bones. And then, without a word, it turned and walked toward the wall, passing through it as though the stone were no more substantial than fog. When I was finally able to move, the air was still cold where it had stood. The rosary lay on the floor. One bead was missing. The first hours of daylight were spent in a haze of unease. I kept to the streets, speaking with anyone who might have seen something unusual in the night. But the villagers seemed more closed off than ever. Some wouldn't meet my eyes. Others made excuses to cut, conversations short. It was as if they knew something was coming and had decided that ignorance was their only protection. By noon, the constable brought word of a letter delivered to the chapel. No sender, no recipient, just left on the altar. Inside was a single sheet of paper on which was drawn a crude map of the village. Certain locations were marked with an X. The rectory, the Black Swan Inn, Hawthorne's Mill, the abandoned property on the moor, and at the centre, circled in black ink, so heavy it tore the paper, was the chapel itself. The message was clear. Every place tied to the shadow's presence was being gathered into one final point. I returned to the chapel that evening, map in hand, and found something I had not noticed before. Along the base of the altar, barely visible in the fading light, were the same jagged marks that had been carved into the stolen envelopes, the lamppost, the dagger's handle. A language, perhaps, not one I could read, but one I had been seeing for weeks. The carvings were fresh. Someone, or something, had been here recently. The first big reveal came when I knelt to examine the markings more closely and found a bead pressed into the groove between two stones. My missing bead. Which meant the shadow had not simply stood in my room last night, it had left something behind, intentionally. But why? That was when I heard it, the creak of the chapel door, slow and deliberate. I straightened, but the aisle was empty. The door stood ajar, cold air, spilling in from the street. Outside, the square was deserted. The only movement came from the faint sway of the chapel's rope in the belfry above. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step louder than the last in the close air. At the top, the bell loomed in the dark. And there, hanging from the clapper, was another rosary. Identical to mine, but this one was whole. Around its beads were wound several strands of black thread, frayed and brittle. I reached for it, but as soon as my fingers touched, the beads. The bell swung once, slowly, releasing a low, heavy toll that reverberated through the empty village. By the time the sound faded, I was no longer alone in the belfry. The shadow stood at the far end, framed by the narrow window. Its head tilted slightly, as though listening to something I could not hear. Then it raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but at the village beyond the window. Its meaning was clear. Whatever was coming next would not end with me. I did not follow it when it stepped backward into the darkness and was gone. I only stood there, the bell rope swaying gently beside me, knowing that the shadow had chosen its ground for the final move. I know where it will happen, but if I go there, I will not return.